Welcome to my socioeconomic channel. This video might be long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand why the world still cannot decide whether markets should be free or controlled. This debate quietly shapes your job, your income, and your future. Is the market a self-healing system naturally finding balance, or a fragile machine that must be controlled by human hands? Chapter 1. The Illusion of Stability Before Collapse. A civilization always believes its prosperity is eternal right until the very moment it shatters. Before the First World War erupted and the Great Depression devoured the global economy, the Western world existed within a magnificent and intoxicating dream. The great empires of Europe and the industrial titans of America sat upon a tremendous accumulation of wealth. They truly believed that human rationality and unrestricted capitalism had permanently conquered scarcity and chaos. The global machine was humming with unprecedented efficiency. Deep within, the thriving cities, factories spewed thick smoke, while relentless assembly lines dictated the rhythms of human existence. A handful of astute industrialists and elite financiers amassed fortunes that eclipsed the royal treasuries of ancient kings. They built extravagant mansions filled with imported treasures and hosted opulent masquerade balls, completely insulated from the grinding poverty and desperation simmering just outside their gilded doors. Within the hallowed halls of institutions like Cambridge University and the majestic cafes of Vienna, elite intellectuals breathed an air of absolute certainty. They looked upon the flourishing global trade networks and concluded that the economy was a flawless mathematical engine. To them, occasional fluctuations were merely minor disruptions that the invisible hand would swiftly and silently correct, without the need for human interference. Yet, this imposing architecture of wealth was constructed upon an exceptionally fragile and unstable foundation. The enormous profits flowing upward relied exclusively upon the relentless exploitation of countless, exhausted laborers who possessed almost no purchasing power. The system was producing vast mountains of gleaming commodities, but the impoverished masses could never afford to consume the very goods. Their weary hands were endlessly manufacturing. The financial architecture of the era was equally deceptive, built upon the rigid and unforgiving rules of the gold standard. Bankers and politicians harbored a dangerous delusion that this metallic anchor would guarantee perpetual monetary stability and prevent any systemic collapse. They ignored the deepening contradictions within the credit markets, blind to the terrifying reality that their sophisticated financial instruments were quietly transforming into explosives. The devastation of the First World War brutally cracked the foundations of these ancient empires, but the economic illusion persisted into the 1920s. The post-war decade birthed a frantic, speculative boom fueled by easy credit and irrational exuberance. Ordinary citizens and elite investors alike poured their entire life savings into a stock market that promised infinite returns, completely detached from underlying economic reality. The greatest danger arrives not when the warning sirens sound, but when the entire world agrees that the sirens will never ring again. Human rationality is the first casualty when financial terror grips the global consciousness. Chapter 2. The Night That Broke Reason. In the freezing winter of 1929, a solitary figure stood upon the desolate roof of a luxurious five-star hotel. This man was John Maynard Keynes, an elite Cambridge intellectual and one of the most respected financial minds in the entire British Empire. Yet at this exact moment, his formidable intellect provided absolutely no comfort. He was staring directly into the terrifying abyss of complete personal bankruptcy. Just weeks prior, Keynes possessed a massive personal fortune built upon what he believed were infallible mathematical models. He had actively mocked the reckless speculators who blindly poured their money into the overheated stock market. He confidently invested in solid commodities, trusting that rational fundamentals would always protect his wealth. He sincerely believed that the global economy operated according to strict, predictable rules governed by supreme logic. But when the Wall Street crash finally arrived, it did not behave like a rational economic correction. It swept across the financial world like a violently contagious psychological disease. The absolute panic instantly vaporized trillions of dollars in wealth, destroying not only the reckless gamblers but also the careful investors. The contagion of fear melted down every single market, dragging his supposedly safe commodities into the devastating downward spiral. Clutching a bottle of stolen brandy with only 3 coins left in his pocket, Keynes experienced a profound intellectual awakening. He realized that the immaculate mathematical equations of classical economics were fundamentally flawed. They utterly failed to account for the primal, uncontrollable emotions that actually drive human behavior. The market was not a perfect machine operated by logic. It was a highly volatile ecosystem, completely dominated by mass psychology. For over a century, the world had blindly worshipped the doctrine of the invisible hand and say's law. Politicians and bankers preached that supply would always create its own demand, and that markets would automatically cure themselves if simply left alone. But as the Great Depression deepened, this beautiful theory turned into a cruel joke. The invisible hand was nowhere to be found when millions faced absolute starvation. The devastation was absolute and terrifyingly democratic. Proud middle-class families, who had diligently saved their entire lives, woke up to find their bank accounts completely erased. Factory owners stared helplessly at mountains of unsold goods while desperate men stood in endless lines, begging for a single slice of bread. The economy was suffering from a massive cardiac arrest, and the traditional doctors were refusing to administer any medicine. As Keynes watched the city lights flicker below him, the core philosophy of a new economic worldview began to crystallize in his mind. If the market is inherently irrational and capable of complete psychological collapse, then waiting for it to self-correct is suicidal. The system desperately required an external force, a powerful stabilizer capable of injecting confidence when fear paralyzes the masses. Rationality had to be artificially imposed. The greatest danger to civilization is not the occasional economic crisis, but the arrogant belief that the market will always magically cure itself. A broken machine requires a master engineer, not a silent prayer to invisible forces. Chapter 3: Keynes, the Engineer of Crisis. John Maynard Keynes was not a man who believed in waiting for miracles. Standing nearly 2 meters tall with an intimidating intellect, he walked through the hallowed halls of Cambridge with supreme elite confidence. As a central figure in the brilliant Bloomsbury cultural circle, he mixed economics with art, even marrying a famous Russian ballerina. To him, the world was completely comprehensible and desperately in need of direction. His genius was not merely theoretical, it was forged in the brutal reality of global geopolitics. Following the devastation of the First World War, Keynes attended the Versailles Peace Conference and watched politicians exact vengeful reparations from Germany. He accurately prophesied that crushing the German economy would inevitably seed the terrifying destruction of another world war. He understood that economic punishment eventually translates into widespread human slaughter. Unlike rigid classical economists who viewed the market as a sacred biological organism, Keynes saw it simply as a highly complex machine. When a magnificent engine suddenly breaks down, you do not stand around waiting for it to magically heal itself. You call upon a skilled engineer to confidently open the hood, identify the broken components, and forcefully repair the damage with concrete interventions. In 1936, he published a revolutionary text that dropped like an intellectual bomb upon the stagnant world. He diagnosed the Great Depression not as a lack of production, but as a fatal collapse of effective demand driven by animal spirits. Paralyzed by irrational fear, terrified citizens hoarded their cash, while panicked entrepreneurs allowed advanced factories to gather dust because no one was buying anything. The traditional cycle was broken, and private investment had completely evaporated. Keynes declared that when the private sector is consumed by terror, the government must relentlessly step forward as the ultimate consumer and investor of last resort. He proposed massive public works, building roads, bridges, and dams to artificially resuscitate the dead economy. Doing nothing in the face of suffering was both intellectual laziness and moral cowardice. He illustrated his radical theory with a deliberately provocative metaphor that shocked conservative thinkers. He suggested that the government should literally pay men to dig useless holes in the ground, and then pay them to fill those holes back up. The point was not the holes themselves, but the transformative multiplier effect of placing hard currency directly into the desperate hands of exhausted and starving workers. When the worker receives his government salary, he buys bread, allowing the baker to buy flour, which empowers the farmer to purchase a tractor. A single dollar injected into a frozen economy creates a tremendous ripple effect, multiplying demand across every sector. Keynes forged the ultimate theoretical weapon, justifying massive state intervention to save capitalism from its own devastating tendency toward complete self-destruction. True moral courage resides not in passively enduring the storm, but in having the audacity to seize the helm. The deepest scars of a civilization are often carried by those who watch its quiet erasure. Chapter 4. Hayek, the Defender of Freedom. Friedrich Hayek was born into the fading twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A descendant of aristocratic scholars, he was raised in a Vienna desperately clinging to its imperial glory. The ornate palaces and beautiful waltzes could not hide the deep fractures tearing the empire apart. He watched as the grand architecture of his youth was dismantled by the devastating aftermath of the First World War. For Hayek, the true horror of the post-war era was not physical destruction, but the psychological terror of hyperinflation. He personally witnessed how reckless printing of money destroyed the entire middle class overnight. A simple postage stamp that cost a few crowns suddenly demanded billions, rendering lifelong savings completely worthless. He learned a brutal lesson that when a currency collapses, the moral fabric of civilization immediately follows. Unlike Keynes, who navigated the corridors of power with supreme arrogance, Hayek remained a solitary and deeply introverted intellectual wolf. He stood firmly outside the political center, carrying the profound alienation of an intellectual exile. His experiences with the disintegration of a massive state made him suspicious of centralized authority, promising to fix the world. he understood that good intentions often pave the road to tyranny. To Hayek, the global economy was absolutely nothing like a mechanical engine that could be tuned by a master engineer. Instead, he viewed it as an infinitely complex, living biological ecosystem. It was composed of millions of independent individuals, each possessing tiny fragments of highly localized knowledge. No single human mind, no matter how brilliant, could ever comprehend or manage this overwhelming ocean of dispersed information. He argued that the true miracle of capitalism was the spontaneous order generated by the price mechanism. Prices are not arbitrary numbers. They are the highly sensitive nervous system of the entire society. When millions of people freely buy and sell, their collective actions organically determine the value of everything. This invisible coordination allows the market to function beautifully without requiring any centralized dictator to issue clumsy commands. Therefore, any artificial intervention by an arrogant government is not a cure, but a violent disruption of this delicate ecological balance. When politicians artificially suppress interest rates or print excess money to create temporary prosperity, they are systematically lying to the market. They distort the vital price signals, forcing honest entrepreneurs to make disastrous investments based on entirely fabricated economic realities. This inevitably ensures a harsher future collapse. Hayek believed that attempting to forcibly mold a complex society into a rigid, centrally planned template was an act of supreme intellectual hubris. It might create a fleeting illusion of stability, but it inevitably destroys the deep, natural equilibrium. He warned that once we surrender our individual economic choices to the state, in exchange for temporary safety, we silently surrender the very foundation of our human liberty. A bird placed inside a golden cage may never starve, but it has traded the sky for a comfortable prison. A battle of ideas often determines the fate of nations far more powerfully than the clash of armies. Chapter 5: The First Great Clash. The Great Depression provided the ultimate intellectual battlefield for these two opposing titans of thought. As global markets shattered and millions of desperate citizens stood in endless breadlines, the old economic textbooks were rendered completely useless. The world was desperately crying out for an immediate savior, and John Maynard Keynes confidently stepped into the spotlight with his revolutionary prescriptions. Keynes diagnosed the global paralysis as a fatal collapse of effective demand, driven entirely by the uncontrollable animal spirits of human panic. He argued that since the private market was paralyzed by terrifying fear, the state must aggressively step in to borrow and spend. By financing massive public works, the government could force the frozen gears of the economy to turn once again. From the academic fortress of the London School of Economics, Friedrich Hayek launched a fierce counterattack against this seductive philosophy. In his treatises on prices and production, Hayek argued that the Great Depression was not a failure of capitalism, but a necessary hangover caused by the reckless, government-engineered credit expansion of the 1920s. The distorted market desperately needed time to purge itself. Hayek believed that pumping artificial stimulus into a crashing economy was like forcing poisonous liquor down the throat of a dying alcoholic. He warned that masking the structural symptoms with fresh government money would only keep bankrupt zombie corporations alive. It would horrifically distort vital price signals and inevitably guarantee a much more catastrophic and unmanageable collapse in the distant future. This intense intellectual dispute quickly devolved into a deeply personal and bitter feud between the two brilliant scholars. Hayek meticulously dismantled Keynes's earlier theories, but Keynes arrogantly dismissed the criticism, claiming he no longer believed his own previous work anyway. Keynes privately mocked Hayek's dense and complex arguments as the most confused garbage he had ever forced himself to read and analyze. The brutal and unforgiving reality of politics ultimately decided the victor of this first great intellectual war. No desperate politician facing furious and starving voters could dare to preach Hayek's cold gospel of patient suffering. Keynes offered an irresistible solution that allowed leaders to act heroically, rescuing the traumatized populace while simultaneously expanding their own centralized state power and authority to unprecedented levels. When humanity is drowning, it will always grasp for the lifeline of immediate action over the cold logic of long-term consequences. The ultimate test of any economic philosophy is not found in academic textbooks, but in the gritty, desperate reality of a starving nation. Chapter 6. When Keynes Saved the World. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency of the United States, he inherited a shattered landscape of unprecedented despair. The Roaring Twenties had violently collapsed, leaving millions of homeless citizens wandering the dust-blown streets. Formerly proud factory workers were reduced to stripping bark from trees just to fill their empty stomachs. The nation was teetering dangerously on the absolute brink of complete social and political annihilation. Desperate for any viable solution to this colossal humanitarian catastrophe, President Roosevelt invited John Maynard Keynes to Washington for urgent strategic consultations. Keynes brought with him a revolutionary blueprint that completely defied orthodox conservative thinking. He advised the president to ignore the deficit, abandon fiscal prudence, and unleash the full financial power of the federal government to artificially resuscitate the paralyzed American economy through massive public investment. This historic meeting birthed the unprecedented ambition of the New Deal, marking the very first time Keynesian theory was applied on a massive national scale. The United States government suddenly transformed into the ultimate employer of last resort. They commissioned enormous infrastructure projects, pouring concrete for giant dams and paving thousands of miles of new highways. They directly injected liquid capital into the pockets of destitute laborers. The results were nothing short of miraculous. The devastated epicenter of the Great Depression slowly began to awaken from its financial coma. The endless lines of unemployed men were gradually replaced by bustling construction sites and roaring factory floors. People finally had bread on their tables and a renewed sense of dignity in their hearts. The state had successfully manufactured hope where only absolute despair previously existed. However, the true global triumph of Keynesian economics arrived with the dark clouds of the Second World War. The global conflict instantly triggered a massive, unprecedented wave of absolute government spending. The terrifying machinery of war operated as the ultimate Keynesian experiment. The colossal military budget completely eradicated unemployment overnight, proving beyond any doubt that astounding government intervention could force an economy into maximum output and extreme efficiency. Through this explosive economic mobilization, the United States transformed into an unstoppable industrial juggernaut. It became the supreme logistics base for the entire Allied war effort against Germany and Japan. The factories produced staggering quantities of munitions, supplying the Soviet Union alone with 14,000 fighter planes 22,800 tanks, and 467,000 vehicles, valued at over $11 billion. This unimaginable display of economic might solidified Keynes as a global savior. Following the victorious conclusion of the war, his radical ideas completely conquered the Western world. His theories were no longer regarded as experimental interventions. They were canonized as the absolute standard manual for modern governance. From Washington to Paris, every prominent political leader enthusiastically embraced the concept of the active, benevolent welfare state. This widespread adoption ushered in an extraordinary golden age of capitalism that lasted for 3 decades. France experienced its glorious 30 years. West Germany celebrated a historic economic miracle, and the United States enjoyed unprecedented middle-class prosperity. Governments confidently believed they had finally mastered the elusive economic cycle. By simply adjusting fiscal dials and monetary levers, they could guarantee perpetual growth and eradicate severe depressions forever. A tamed monster often appears harmless until you forget exactly how and why it was chained in the first place. The loudest cheers of victory often deafen society to the silent approaching footsteps of tyranny. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Warning. While the entire Western world enthusiastically built shrines to honor John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek endured the most profound and crushing solitude of his entire intellectual life. As the new Keynesian consensus manufactured an unprecedented economic boom, the arrogant academic establishment swiftly marginalized Hayek, treating him as a tragic relic possessing utterly obsolete and irrelevant theories. When he eventually migrated to the United States, the prestigious economics department at the University of Chicago brutally rejected his application, deeming his Austrian school philosophy completely incomprehensible. He was ultimately banished to a respectable academic exile within a multidisciplinary department known as the Committee on Social Thought. This cold rejection forced a magnificent evolution within his mind. Realizing that he had thoroughly lost the technical debate among pure economists, Hayek boldly shifted his intellectual battlefield toward the vast and terrifying landscape of political philosophy. In 1944, as the war ravaged Europe, he published a shocking masterpiece titled The Road to Serfdom. He issued a haunting warning directed at every ordinary citizen. Hayek eloquently argued that fundamental economic freedom was the absolute bedrock guarding every other essential human liberty. He warned that once a society permits the government to aggressively control prices and intervene under the noble guise of social welfare, a terrifying slippery slope immediately begins. To effectively control national production, the state must inevitably control individual employment. If a centralized government dictates where you must work and what you must produce, it inevitably requires absolute control over human thought and personal ambition. He traced a direct philosophical chain linking benevolent economic planning to the absolute horrors of totalitarian dictatorships. He declared that well-intentioned policies frequently devolve into unstoppable machines of systemic human oppression. Despite their deep intellectual animosity, a beautiful anecdote highlighting their profound mutual respect emerged during the devastating German bombing campaigns over London. Keynes graciously arranged safe accommodation for Hayek at King's College. Together, these two giant adversaries stood watch upon the chapel roof, bravely guarding the ancient architecture against falling Nazi incendiary bombs throughout the burning night. After reading The Road to Serfdom, Keynes sent a remarkable letter confessing that, while he still disagreed with the economics, he found himself deeply and morally moved by Hayek's philosophical conclusions. However, the general public mostly ignored Hayek's warnings, embracing the comfort of massive government spending. He remained a solitary prophet crying out within the forgotten wilderness. Refusing to surrender, Hayek secretly gathered a dedicated brotherhood of exiled free market believers, including the brilliant young Milton Friedman, at a remote mountain in Switzerland. Together, they formed the Mont Pelerin Society, quietly planting the intellectual seeds for a future global revolution. They patiently waited for the inevitable day when the magnificent Keynesian empire would finally crumble. The chains of oppression are rarely forged in malice. They are usually forged with the warmest intentions of universal salvation. An empire built upon an illusion will eventually be crushed by the weight of its own contradictions. Chapter 8: The Crisis of Keynesianism. For nearly 3 decades following the Second World War, the Keynesian consensus ruled the global economy with absolute and unquestioned authority. Elite policymakers truly believed they had permanently conquered the chaos of capitalism. They functioned like arrogant mechanics, confidently pulling levers to maintain perfect employment. The devastating memory of the Great Depression was completely dismissed as a historical anomaly that their brilliant mathematical models had eradicated forever. However, as the 1970s dawned, a dark and inexplicable phenomenon began to suffocate the Western world. A bizarre economic disease emerged that textbooks claimed was absolutely impossible. It was a terrifying mutant known as stagflation, a devastating combination of severe economic stagnation occurring simultaneously with rampant, uncontrollable inflation. The shimmering golden age violently collided with a brutal reality that defied every established rule of modern macroeconomics. For generations, economists had blindly trusted a sacred concept known as the Phillips curve. This theory promised a predictable seesaw relationship between inflation and unemployment. If governments stimulated the economy, jobs would increase while prices rose slightly. If they hit the brakes, prices dropped but unemployment climbed. They believed they could perpetually balance upon this elegant mathematical beam. But suddenly, the seesaw violently snapped in half. Ordinary citizens were thrust into an unimaginable and exhausting nightmare. They suffered the agonizing humiliation of losing their jobs and standing in endless unemployment lines. Yet, unlike previous depressions where prices plummeted, the cost of basic survival was simultaneously exploding. Every trip to the grocery store became a tragedy as the price of food visibly increased. Their hard-earned savings were quietly evaporating into thin air. Panicked politicians and baffled central bankers responded with the only medicine they understood. They desperately unleashed more government spending and printed vast quantities of currency, hoping to resuscitate dying demand. But in an economy already choking on inflated prices, this heavy-handed Keynesian intervention acted exactly like throwing gasoline onto a raging forest fire. The searing flames of inflation merely burned higher and far more destructively. In an act of supreme political desperation, United States President Richard Nixon imposed peacetime wage and price controls across the entire nation. He attempted to forcibly outlaw inflation by issuing presidential decrees, demanding that markets bend to his executive will. This massive overreach achieved absolutely nothing except creating severe artificial shortages. It proved you cannot legislate away deep structural rot caused by decades of easy money. The mighty Keynesian edifice once worshipped as the ultimate savior of modern capitalism, was crumbling into irrelevance. The arrogant assumption that brilliant technocrats could flawlessly manage an infinitely complex human society was exposed as a fatal delusion. Global economic captains were trapped inside a terrifying storm, frantically spinning a broken steering wheel. The world was drowning, and the gods of economic intervention had finally and catastrophically failed. When the engineers of prosperity become the architects of ruin, society must search for a prophet it previously crucified. A ghost from the past seldom returns to save the present, unless the present has become entirely unbearable. Chapter 9: Hayek's Return. While the stagnant economies of the 1970s crumbled under the weight of unsolvable contradictions, the world desperately searched for an explanation that Keynesian textbooks could no longer provide. The arrogant technocrats who had confidently steered the global economy for 30 years were now standing helplessly before a machine that refused to obey their commands. In this moment of profound intellectual paralysis, the sidelined prophet finally had his voice restored. In 1974, the global academic community was stunned when Friedrich Hayek was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. This was not merely a ceremonial acknowledgement of past contributions. It was a seismic shift in the global intellectual paradigm. The prize signaled that the dominant economic establishment was finally admitting defeat, acknowledging that the forgotten Austrian economist might actually hold the missing key to understanding the current disaster. Standing before the esteemed audience in Stockholm, Hayek delivered an acceptance speech that functioned as a devastating post-mortem for the Keynesian era. He titled his address "The Pretense of Knowledge" and used it to brutally dismantle the hubris of modern macroeconomics. He argued that the ultimate original sin of politicians and academics was pretending. They possessed sufficient knowledge to manually control something as infinitely complex as a global economy. He carefully explained why stagflation was not an unforeseeable accident, but the absolute inevitable consequence of 3 decades of relentless government interference. By artificially pumping massive quantities of excess money into the system to guarantee full employment, governments had systematically destroyed the crucial information network provided by honest prices. They had blinded the economy, leading entrepreneurs to make disastrous, unsustainable investments across every industry. The pain the world was currently enduring was simply the market violently attempting to reassert reality over fiction. The artificial prosperity engineered by Keynesian demand stimulation could not be maintained without accelerating inflation to apocalyptic levels. The bill for decades of easy credit had finally come due, and no amount of clever government manipulation could defer the pain any longer. The hangover had arrived. Hayek's theories penetrated far beyond the walls of academia, reaching a public that was exhausted by high taxes, rising prices, and overbearing bureaucracies. The common citizen was no longer enchanted by the promises of the benevolent welfare state. They saw their savings eroded by inflation and their opportunities stifled by endless regulations. The intellectual ground was perfectly prepared for a radical and unforgiving free market revolution. He argued that the only true remedy for this deep structural rot was immediate and absolute abstinence from further government intervention. The market needed to violently purge the inefficient zombie companies and reallocate misdirected capital, no matter how painful the immediate rise in unemployment might be. This was not a message of cruelty, but a plea for long-term economic sanity and sustainable human flourishing. A society that repeatedly drinks poison to cure a headache must eventually face the horrific consequences of its chosen medicine. A revolution promising absolute liberty often exacts a brutal toll from those who cannot afford to compete. Chapter 10. The Price of Freedom. The intellectual victory of Friedrich Hayek did not remain confined to the sterile halls of academia for long. As the 1970s ended in complete economic disarray, two formidable political figures stepped onto the global stage, fully armed with his Austrian school philosophy. They were ready to violently dismantle the entrenched Keynesian welfare state and unleash the raw, unforgiving power of the free market upon the world. In Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher, the formidable daughter of a humble grocer, rose to absolute power. She possessed a visceral, instinctive hatred for state interference. During a tense Conservative Party meeting discussing compromise, she famously slammed Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty, hard onto the heavy wooden table. She glared at her colleagues and coldly declared that this specific text was the only philosophy they would now believe. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, a former Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan captured the American presidency. He possessed an unmatched charisma that translated complex Austrian economics into brilliant, digestible slogans. He stooped before the exhausted American public and famously proclaimed that government was not the solution to their agonizing problems. Government was, in fact, the very root cause of the problem itself. This powerful transatlantic alliance launched a devastating neoliberal revolution that shocked the global system. Following the guidance of Milton Friedman, central banks aggressively jacked up interest rates into double digits. This brutal monetary squeeze successfully strangled the terrifying beast of inflation, but it intentionally triggered a severe and agonizing economic recession that plunged millions of ordinary citizens directly into deep unemployment and despair. The era of ruthless privatization had officially commenced. Massive state-owned enterprises, from telecommunications to aviation and energy, were swiftly sold off to private investors. The protective regulations that had handcuffed corporations for decades were violently slashed. To complete this market transformation, both leaders launched a relentless assault against the entrenched power of labor unions, decimating their ability to organize strikes and demand higher wages. The bitter irony of this capitalist resurgence was the staggering collateral damage inflicted upon the working class. While the wealthy elite capitalized immensely on deregulated financial markets and slashed corporate taxes, the fragile social safety net was ruthlessly shredded. The gap between the ultra-rich and the struggling poor widened into a terrifying chasm, leaving vulnerable populations completely exposed to the ruthless mechanics of unrestricted global competition. Hayek had always insisted that the inevitable price of a truly free society was the enduring presence of deep financial inequality. He believed that shielding people from the brutal consequences of the market only fosters weakness and destroys innovation. Yet, as entire industrial towns crumbled, and generations of factory workers were permanently discarded, the world began to question whether this absolute market freedom was actually worth such horrific human sacrifices. The invisible hand may be exceptionally efficient at creating unprecedented wealth, but it possesses absolutely no human empathy for those it quietly crushes. A system stripped of all its protective barriers will inevitably invite the very storm it claimed to have conquered. Chapter 11. The return of intervention. The triumph of neoliberalism appeared absolute during the exuberant decades leading up to the 21st century. Politicians and financial elites convinced themselves that unrestricted markets had finally defeated the business cycle entirely. They systematically dismantled the regulatory fortresses constructed after the Great Depression, believing that modern mathematical models could infinitely disperse risk. Wall Street transformed into a limitless casino where hubris blinded everyone to the approaching catastrophe. In 2008, this magnificent edifice of unregulated capital collapsed with terrifying speed and violence. The fall of Lehman Brothers sent a devastating shockwave through the entire global financial nervous system. The complex instruments supposed to eradicate risk morphed instantly into toxic weapons. Overnight, the proud masters of the universe were reduced to panicked children, begging for the exact government intervention they had spent decades relentlessly mocking. Faced with the imminent annihilation of the global banking system, ideological purity was instantly abandoned. The staunch defenders of the free market suddenly rushed into the emergency room, frantically tearing open the forgotten medical kit of John Maynard Keynes. Governments across the world refused to wait for the market to naturally cleanse itself. Instead, they injected trillions of borrowed dollars directly into the veins of paralyzed financial institutions. This colossal rescue mission prevented a second Great Depression, but it generated a profound sense of moral rot. The exhausted working class watched in absolute horror as the bankers who ignited the inferno received massive bailouts. The capitalist system had mutated into a grotesque monstrosity. Astonishing profits remained fiercely privatized for the elite, while devastating systemic losses were forcefully socialized directly onto the heavy shoulders of the ordinary taxpayer. Once again, the ghost of Friedrich Hayek whispered his dark warnings through the corridors of power. By refusing to let the reckless gamblers face the brutal consequences of their actions, the state had destroyed the essential disciplinary mechanism of capitalism, he warned, that masking systemic rot with enormous injections of artificial liquidity only guarantees a much larger and more catastrophic implosion sometime in the distant, unpredictable future. We saved the financial architecture by mortgaging the deepest foundations of our social trust. The greatest tragedies in human history do not arise from ignorance, but from the arrogant belief that we have finally discovered the perfect answer. Chapter 12. The Endless Debate. For nearly 1 century, we have been conditioned to view the epic conflict between John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek as a brutal, zero-sum intellectual war. We have falsely believed that one must ultimately triumph while the other must be completely eradicated from the pages of history. But what if this binary perspective is the exact reason why our global economy remains trapped in a perpetual cycle of devastating booms and horrific busts? Consider John Maynard Keynes as the ultimate emergency room physician operating during a terrifying and imminent medical code blue. When the global financial artery suddenly severs and the entire economic body plunges into fatal shock, pure market freedom offers absolutely no immediate comfort. His aggressive prescriptions function as the crucial defibrillator, providing the massive artificial jolt necessary to keep the patient alive long enough for the natural healing process to even begin to work. However, the profound tragedy occurs when panicked politicians refuse to disconnect the patient from this powerful artificial life support. When desperate emergency measures are transformed into permanent structural policies, the essential organic immunity of the economy is systematically destroyed. We develop a horrifying dependency on endless debt and relentless government bailouts, transforming temporary survival tactics into a toxic addiction that slowly rots the deepest foundations of the financial system over many quiet decades. This is precisely where the cold, unforgiving wisdom of Friedrich Hayek must intervene as the ultimate long-term health manager. He harshly reminds us that true economic vitality cannot be artificially manufactured inside a bureaucratic laboratory. His philosophy serves as the essential societal compass, warning us that continually suppressing short-term pain with printed money inevitably guarantees a much larger, incurable disease sometime in the distant and unpredictable future. We are therefore condemned to navigate a brutal and exhausting paradox throughout the modern era. We desperately need the deep empathetic intervention of Keynes to construct a compassionate social safety net that protects vulnerable citizens from complete annihilation during a crisis. Yet, we simultaneously require the ruthless disciplinary framework of Hayek to unleash authentic human innovation and prevent the government from quietly mutating into an overbearing, totalitarian leviathan that slowly consumes our sacred individual liberties. The core problem resides not within the brilliant theories themselves, but within the absolute cowardice of our global political architecture. Democratic leaders possess the tremendous courage to aggressively deploy Keynesian stimulus when the storm rages because handing out cash secures immediate popularity and votes. But they almost never possess the resolute moral discipline required to embrace in Hayek's painful cleansing process once the storm has passed, choosing instead to kick the exploding can further down the road. Consequently, the great pendulum of human history will continue to swing violently between the poles of absolute freedom and rigid control. We will build arrogant monuments to unrestricted capitalism until the market inevitably collapses under its own enormous greed. Then, terrified by the chaos, we will surrender our freedoms to bureaucratic saviors until their suffocating control stagnates the human spirit and sparks a desperate revolution back toward liberty. We are forever trapped navigating a treacherous ocean, desperately needing both a sturdy anchor to survive the hurricane and unfettered sails to ever reach the distant horizon. The ultimate battlefield of economic philosophy is not found in academic journals, but within the daily struggles of your own personal life. Chapter 13. What this means for you. The grand debates between John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek might seem like distant echoes from a forgotten century, but they secretly dictate every aspect of your modern existence. When you apply for a mortgage, struggle to pay inflated grocery bills, or fear losing your job during a sudden corporate downsizing, you are intimately experiencing the direct consequences of their enduring ideological war. You are the living battleground. When the government suddenly distributes emergency stimulus checks or artificially lowers interest rates to encourage your borrowing, that is the invisible hand of Keynes reaching directly into your wallet. It provides a beautiful, intoxicating illusion of immediate financial safety. However, this fleeting comfort constantly demands a hidden and terrifying price, quietly eroding your future purchasing power through the inevitable and relentless cruelty of long-term currency inflation. Conversely, when you witness massive corporations ruthlessly cutting thousands of loyal employees to maximize shareholder value without any state intervention, You are witnessing the cold reality of Hayek's free market. It ruthlessly punishes inefficiency and demands absolute individual self-reliance. This system offers unprecedented opportunities for massive wealth creation, but it completely strips away the comforting safety net, leaving you entirely exposed to the brutal winds of global competition. To survive and truly thrive within this complex financial architecture, you must cultivate a profound intellectual awakening. You can no longer afford to be a passive consumer, blindly trusting that politicians or central bankers possess the flawless formula for your personal salvation. True financial independence requires recognizing when the market is dangerously intoxicated by cheap credit and understanding exactly when the protective state is mutating into a suffocating prison. If this deep exploration into the invisible mechanics of our global economy has brought you genuine clarity and value, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. We will relentlessly continue to decode the hidden socioeconomic systems and psychological forces that secretly shape our world, empowering you to navigate this chaotic reality with absolute confidence and unshakable intellectual freedom. As you look toward the uncertain future of your own life, ask yourself honestly, would you prefer the comforting illusion of stability, regulated by absolute control, or the terrifying authenticity of freedom accompanied by infinite risk?